In the dry states of the Southwest, there's a group that's been denied a basic human right.
In the Navajo Nation today, a third of our households don't have running water.
But that's not something they chose for themselves. Can the Navajo people reclaim their right to water and contend with the government's legacy of control and neglect?
Our water, our future, our water, our future.
That's in the next season of Reclaimed, the lifeblood of Navajo Nation. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.
If you don't star in your own life, who wants to be a bit player in their own life? And you challenge people to do that.
Well, that's what Pinocchio is at the beginning of his adventure, right? Because he has these strings and invisible forces are pulling on him from behind the scenes. And you don't want to be that. And that is what you are unless you're playing this role in your own life.
You've heard me say right now in our country that we've got issues. And on the short list is how it feels like so many people have simply forgotten how to treat one another with dignity and respect, abandoning what it means to be a good neighbor, citizen, and hero in their own life. And what is even more frightening is that we have a generation of many young adults that don't truly understand responsibility, hard work, or real sacrifice. What we need is a lesson on how to restore the values and identity that this country and the Western world were built on. Now, my guest tonight has a few ideas on how to do just that. Dr. Jordan Peterson is a best-selling author, a clinical psychologist whose podcast frequently tops the charts in the education category. His international lecture tour has sold out more than 400 venues. In his new book, We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine, Dr. Peterson guides readers through the ancient foundational stories of the Western world. While doing so, he analyzes the biblical accounts of rebellion, sacrifice, suffering, and triumph that stabilize, inspire, and unite us culturally and psychologically. Now, Dr. Peterson, first, congratulations. I'm proud to call you friend, and I'm proud of this book that you've done. And you believe this book can truly change people's lives, and that's a bold statement.
Well, I don't think it's bold if you consider the source of what it's analyzing. I mean, the stories that I'm dealing with in this book have changed individual lives and societies literally for thousands of years. What I'm attempting to do, or doing perhaps, is bringing new life to old tales and making them immediately understandable and practically understandable. But the power of that is in the stories. And as you said in your introduction, to unite us and give us direction psychologically and socially. That is what a story does. Certainly, the story of our own lives does that for us personally, especially if the story is oriented properly. And then the stories that we share, they define our culture, and they do, literally, they are what unite us socially. And so I'm trying to, in this book, I'm explaining that. The most important element of the explanation likely is that a description of the structure that does unite us psychologically and socially and give us direction, that description is a story. That's what a story is. That's why they're so compelling to us and why they're so important.
We both believe in facts, empirical, replicatable studies, evidence-based treatment, and therapies. We're both very dedicated to that. But empirical facts, without a story to put them into context, without a story that people can relate to and wrap their arms around, concepts we don't even remember them. They just kind of evaporate without a story.
That indicates a number of things. It indicates, first, that our memories themselves are structured as stories. And so if you encounter a fact that isn't relevant, that you don't care about, you don't remember it because there's no place to put it. Our memories are structured in a narrative manner, which is why, for example, when someone asks you what you've done during the day, or they ask you to tell you about their life, then you tell a story, because that's how your memory is structured. And then you alluded to this as well, is there's an indefinite number of facts. There's as many facts as there are things or combinations of things. And most of those aren't relevant. We don't care about them. They're not related to our lives or even to each other. The structure that makes a fact important and that relates it to other facts in a meaningful way, that is a story. When you go to a movie and you watch the hero pursue his adventure, what you're seeing through his eyes are the relevant facts of his world. And that's what the story lays out. And so the empiricists, the scientific types, let's say, the pure scientists who believe that we only move through the world in consequence of our knowledge of facts, didn't wrestle with the fact that you have to prioritize. Everything you do is a prioritization. Every directional movement of your eyes is prioritization with regards to what's important. It's all a reflection of the story that you inhabit. And so once you understand that the story is irreplaceable and that you see the world through a story, the only question that emerges is what's the appropriate story? And I analyze that in detail in this book.
Oh, yes, you do. And you've got my mind racing. We have so much to discuss. I don't want to keep the audience out of this. Let's go downstairs and dive into this.
Great. Looking forward to it.
Please welcome my friend, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. Thank you, thank you. Well, you have some fans in the room.
Well, that's nice. I'm very glad to hear that.
Let's just jump right into this. You've written a book entitled We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine, which we're seeing here. So I always grew up, as I'm sure you had people trying to program you this way. I rejected it. You obviously rejected it. That said science and religion were inextricably oppositional, just that there was no way to reconcile the scientific model with religion because faith, you can't come up with an empirical proof of faith, and so they were just seen as, you can't reconcile those two. How did you reconcile that supposed conflict?
Well, I would say I'm still doing that. It's a very tricky thing to negotiate, which is why that claim has existed, let's say, for 300 or 400 years. There has been many very significant scientists who rejected that claim. So the greatest developmental psychologist, child psychologist of the 20th century, a man named Jean Piaget, he started to become a developmental psychologist because he wanted to understand how children built their models of the world, because he wanted to understand how we understand things, and he wanted to reconcile the difference between science and religion. Piaget cracked the problem to a great degree. He partly did that by showing that there's a finite number of stable ways that people can interact with one another, that they will continue voluntarily, that improve. So imagine that's a good definition of a friendship. The way to establish a friendship if you're a child is that you play a game with another child. Now, during the game, you have to let the other child take a turn and maybe even have a hand in deciding what the game is going to be. So you both have to want to play, okay? Then you have to play in a way that makes the other person happy to play with you. Okay, if you do that, then they're going to want to play with you repeatedly. Okay, now you have a friend. Okay, so now you see that, and that's a social community. That's like the basis of social community, that friendship. And that's voluntary engagement in a voluntarily chosen game. Now, if it's a really good game and a really good friendship, it improves as you play it, which is what you'd hope for in a marriage. Now, imagine that there's a very small number of ways that you can interact with someone else that's game-like, so you're both playing, so that you want to continue it voluntarily, you'll work for that. That improves across time. And then imagine you have to add to that the fact that you could bring more people into the game. Okay. The description of that game is the aim of the religious enterprise. Right. How do you treat someone else? Well, so here's a religious injunction. You treat other people, including even your enemies perhaps, as if they had the same value as you, assuming that you also have value, right? You're made in the image of God, let's say. You have intrinsic value. Other people do too, and it's equivalent to yours. Well, that's one of the rules for this game. Now, you might say, well, I don't believe that. It's like, okay, try playing a game that doesn't have that as a rule. So your rule might be, I'm going to get what I can take from you, right? That's a psychopathic game. And you can play that game for a short period of time with people and you can get some of what you want. But as soon as people figure out who you are, they run away. This is why Cain, in the story of Cain and Abel, Cain has got this psychopathic element. He ends up as a wanderer in the land of Nod. Okay, he's a wanderer because who wants to play with him? He's bitter and resentful. So he has to wander like a criminal in search of new victims. And he's in the land of Nod. You know, that's where children go when they sleep. Well, if you're unconscious enough that you take advantage of other people, then you're existing in a state of, what would you say, self-induced sleep. Yeah, so he's a criminal wanderer in the land of unconsciousness. It's like, that's the alternative game. No one's going to play that game with you. You're not even going to play the game with yourself for any length of time. Yes. Like the game of power, the reason the game of power is wrong is because it collapses under its own weight as it proceeds. And so there's a very finite number of ways that you can treat people that work. And you might think if you're really good at it, not only are people your friends, but they're lining up to be your friends. And so that's what you do with your kids when you try to teach them to be a good sport instead of winning. Because you're trying to teach them to win the game of having people want to play with them instead of the game of winning this, this particular game.
Yeah. Poor sleep affects more than just energy. It impacts focus, mood, and overall health. If you've struggled with falling asleep or staying asleep or found other sleep aids ineffective, Beam's Dream Powder could be your solution. Dream Powder is a healthy, science-backed hot cocoa for better sleep made with natural ingredients like reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, apigenin, and melatonin to help you fall asleep faster, stay asleep longer, and wake up refreshed. Unlike other sleep aids, Dream doesn't cause next-day grogginess. It's delicious, guilt-free, and available in flavors like sea salt caramel, brownie batter, and cinnamon cocoa with just 15 calories and 0 grams of sugar per serving. If you want to try Beam's best-selling Dream Powder, get up to 40% off for a limited time when you go to shopbeam.com/Dr. Phil and use code Dr. Phil at checkout. That's shopbeam.com/Dr. Phil and use code Dr. Phil for up to 40% off. If you're worried about IRS collection tactics, you don't have to face them alone. Tax Network USA is here to help. Tax Network USA is the nation's premier tax relief firm and has negotiated over $1 billion in tax relief for clients. Our services include penalty forgiveness, hardship programs where you might not have to repay anything until your tax debt expires, and offer in compromise solutions for lump sum settlements. Whether you owe $10,000 or $10 million, our experts are ready to assist you. Even if you're behind on taxes due to missing personal or business records, Tax Network USA can guide you through the process. Tax season is long over, and for the IRS, that means it's collection season. To schedule complimentary consultation, call 1-800-958-1000 or visit tnusa.com/Dr. Phil. Don't let the IRS's aggressive tactics control your life. Take charge of your financial future. Visit tnusa.com/Dr. Phil today. You quote Luke 6:31, then, which everybody knows is the golden rule, which is not sociopathic or psychopathic, and it doesn't exclude competitiveness either.
Definitely not. So it says, what you would want other men to do to you, you should do to them. It's like, well, you hear the unwise, hypothetically hyper-compassionate type saying, we shouldn't have competition in games. It's like, you want competition in your marriage of the right sort. It's like, Eve means something like, what would you say, viable contender. The name Eve means worthy adversary in play. That's a good way of thinking about it. Your partner in your marriage, you can think about that as a long-term game, is someone you want to contend with, right? You don't want them to be a pushover. You want them to encourage you in your best. If you're playing a game with someone, pick up basketball one-on-one. You don't want to play with someone you can just demolish. You want to play with someone who's maybe a little better than you, because then you get better as you play. You want that competition built in. And when you say you should treat people like you'd want to treat them, you have to think about, well, how would you want to be treated if you were treated the way that would be best for you? Well, you don't want people to excuse every stupid thing you do. You want people to hold you accountable and to keep you on the straight and narrow and to encourage you when you're doing difficult things. And like that's that reciprocal love. It's not being nice to other people. It's way more complicated and sophisticated than that. And some of that is that competition.
Sure, it sharpens you.
Definitely, yeah. And you want to be sharp because there's things you're going to have to cut through.
Yeah, because if you're not challenged, if they don't hold you to some standard, you become a slug.
You also have no respect for them.
We who wrestle with God, perceptions of the divine. What I got from this is you're taking those stories and saying, let's look at these differently than what your typical clergy might have used these stories for in the past. I want to relate these in a way that people can use them and say, what does this say to me about what I need to do in this day and time when everything seems to be getting questioned? Everything seems to be challenging the identification of man and society and all. You say, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Let's find some constants. Let's go back and look at what has held across centuries and centuries and see if those lessons hold, and they seem to hold.
Well, one way of contemplating the fact of the biblical stories, let's say, is to understand that those are the stories that have survived for millennia. There's a reason for that. Stories are only remembered insofar as they retain their relevance. Well, those are the stories that have retained their relevance and have compelled people to remember them for, we don't know how many thousands of years. In the oldest stories, it could be 25,000 years. It's a very, very long time. And so what that indicates is that those are the stories that people have been able to return to in times of trouble to stabilize them when everything's up in the air. And that worked successfully because otherwise the tradition would have been broken, and it hasn't been broken. Now, we live in a time where one of the hallmarks of virtue is the celebration of diversity. Now, the problem with diversity as such is that diversity can mean plenty and it can mean opportunity, but it can also mean confusion and chaos. And so an accidental and careless diversity means the disintegration of everything, including your own psyche, into warring elements. You need a unity because a unity unites, right? And if you're not united within yourself, then you're a house divided against itself, and a house divided against itself necessarily falls. That's true individually and it's true socially. So in the opening sequence of Genesis, which describes the origin of being, right? The beginning of the world. It describes more than that. It describes how the world was created, is created, and forever will be created. It spans time. And there's an insistence in that text that the word, so the words you use, the word itself, if it is properly spoken, which means to be spoken in alliance with the truth and motivated by what's highest, if you speak in that manner, if you use your words in that manner, then you're part of the process that makes possibility into the order that's good. Now, you know that deeply, because you know that if you operate within your family and you tell your children and your wife or your husband the truth, then if you have the courage to do that, then you have the possibility of setting things straight and establishing a firm foundation. Well, that's part of the manner in which you reflect the image of God. The idea is that human beings are reflections of the image of God. That's what makes us valuable. Well, why? Because we partake in the process of ongoing creation by utilizing our language, for example, in the service of what's good and what's true. And that's right. It's exactly 100% right. Now, part of the reason that you have rights in the United States and Western cultures in general is because we're part of the tradition that insists that every person has that quality. Everyone has something vital to bring into the world that's unique, that the world is less without that contribution. And you make that contribution with your allegiance to the truth. You need to understand that. You can see how that's practically relevant. It's like, well, why tell the truth? Because the world degenerates into chaotic hell if you don't. And that's exactly right. We know, for example, in totalitarian states, which you could think of as the opposite of free and well-constituted Western societies, let's say, in a totalitarian state, everyone lies about everything to themselves and everyone else 100% of the time. And that's why those societies degenerate into hell. And it really is hell. For all intents and purposes, it's hell. And you might think, well, is hell eternal? It's like, if you're in hell, you're going to think it's eternal. At least. I mean, you've been in situations where you've suffered stupidly and pointlessly. And maybe in the consequence of your own foolishness. That's a good definition of hell.
Yeah. By the way, this is what it's like going to dinner with Jordan. That's why he's slim and I'm not. Because while we're at dinner, I'm eating and he's preaching and going on. I don't even remember what I asked him.
You asked me about the relevance of the story, why they're still relevant.
There was something in there.
I'm excited to tell you about one of my favorite podcasts called The Newsworthy. It's one of the most efficient ways to stay informed on a daily basis that will seriously change how you think about news. If you hate the constant barrage of news alerts on your phone, arguing pundits, opinions, and misinformation, and all those anxiety-inducing clickbait headlines you see now, you've got to try this podcast. It's an independent journalist who left her career with mainstream media to launch her own show. Her team does all the hard work of reviewing and researching what's going on across a variety of sources from both sides of the aisle. Then they bring the most important and interesting stories together in one convenient place. I'm talking 10 stories to know each day in just about 10 minutes. The variety of news is impressive too. I feel so well-rounded after every episode. Just search The Newsworthy in your podcast app or go to thenewsworthy.com to start listening. Again, search for the podcast The Newsworthy, 2 words, The Newsworthy, to make staying informed easier and more enjoyable every weekday.
One of the things that people will get out of this book, which is amazing, by the way, the book is great, and you can put it down for a second and walk away, which you'll need to do because it's very thought-provoking, and it will cause you to really write things down and think about them. But if we think back through our lives, and maybe I'm just boring, but I bet for most people, a lot of our lives are wallpaper. And then there are a number of days that pop out and stand out against the wallpaper. And those are the stories that we remember. Mm-hmm. And that's the same way you're talking about here. There are stories that you've identified that have this commonality to them, that this relatability to them, that you think will really challenge people to evaluate where they are and how they're spending their lives. Here you go.
Well, the pop-out idea is dead on the money. So I'll give you an example of how that relates to these biblical stories. There are important times in your life where something of significance has occurred. So we tell stories about the important episodes of our life because they make themselves manifest to us as significant, and they'll capture the interest of other people. So there's something there that matters deeply. That's what happens to Moses in the desert when he encounters the burning bush. So Moses is just going about his business as a shepherd. He's run away from Egypt at that point, despite being an aristocrat, and he's taken on a relatively lowly life, although an adult life, as a shepherd, a guardian of the vulnerable, a protector against predators. It's a hard job being a shepherd. He has to be out on his own, taking care of himself and his flock. He's married and he's got some responsibility, but he's an ordinary person at this point, and he's out in the desert and he's near a mountain because enlightenment occurs near a mountain, and he sees something that glimmers to him and beckons. Okay, this happens to all of us, as you're doing your ordinary things and something captures your attention or your imagination. The question is, what is that? Now, you can ignore that. Maybe you'd ignore that if you wanted to stay with the wallpaper. You want to stay in your rut. Or you could go off the beaten path and you could investigate. And that's what Moses does. And he sees this tree that's burning. That's a symbol of life itself, because a tree is alive. A tree is a symbol of life. And everything alive metabolizes, and that's a kind of flame. And if you see something intensely alive, which is what you see when you see someone you love, let's say, it's on fire. And so that's what Moses sees. He sees deep into the nature of what compels us, and he goes and investigates. As he gets closer, he starts to understand that he's on sacred ground. See, what captures your interest and pulls you out of your rut, that is a manifestation of the sacred. This is by definition. And if you investigate what compels you and calls to you, you go deeper into it. And that's what happens to Moses. He takes off his shoes, and that signifies his willingness to change his identity, because shoes are emblematic of identity, like Cinderella's shoes, for example, or the witch's shoes in The Wizard of Oz. And so he starts to deeply investigate this thing that's called to him, and what happens? The divine itself speaks to him and says, I'm the ground of being that's revealing itself to you. And if you continue this pursuit, you will change by necessity into the leader that you should be. And Moses allows that to happen, despite the fact that he knows he's not a good speaker. He has all sorts of flaws, and God basically says, I don't care about your flaws. That you can't use them as an excuse. If you pursue what compels you, it will transform you, and you have to make the best of a bad lot. And that's your responsibility. And you have to figure out how to do that despite your flaws. Moses communes with this calling, this thing that attracts him, that's not wallpaper, that's memorable. And God says, the mere fact that you've had this experience will allow you to speak the words that people will respond to. Because Moses says, well, I'm going to go talk to the Pharaohs and my people, the Israelites. Why are they going to listen to me? And the answer to that is, if you pursue what compels you forward and you discuss it truthfully, people will listen, because you speak then with the voice of authority. And that's the nature of charisma, when it's genuine, when it's not narcissistic and false.
You know, my dad used to say, Christmas is when people who don't know each other all that well get together in a space that is too small to spend too much time together. Dr. Phil here with your Mental Health Moment, Holiday Edition, brought to you by my good friends at Michael's. Your one-stop holiday shop to make the season bright. With everything you need to create a joyful holiday ambiance for every style, space, and budget. Now, some people love having their entire extended family sleep under the same roof for the holidays. But if you don't like sleeping on a sofa and sharing a bathroom with your 12th second cousins, getting a hotel or motel room nearby just might be worth its weight in gold. Now, maybe the kids want to stay at grandma's and sleep on the floor and play Uno until 3 a.m., but you can get away and take a shower and a nap. You might even turn it into a mini honeymoon. Break the mold and do what works best for your family. Not what I should do, must do. What will make it much nicer for the holidays for everyone is what you want to focus on. This is not a time that should be stressful. This is a time for common sense and saying, hey, what really works? And maybe what really works is not what's always been done. It's what works for your family and your situation. And sometimes that means taking a step back and not being quite so intensively together. Thanks again to Michael's for ensuring that holiday enthusiasts and last-minute shoppers can find what they need when they need it. In stores and online at michaels.com. You said something that I thought was really interesting. It seems to kind of be at variance with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You say one of the keys in the Book of Abraham, because the Book of Abraham details out the meaningful pathway of life, isn't security, safety, hedonic self-gratification, any of that, which I read to simply be the most meaningful pathway of life is not the safest route. You got to get out of your comfort zone. You've got to challenge yourself. Talk about that.
Well, you might think about that as a flaw in consumerist capitalism and socialism equally. Like, you might think, well, you'd be happy if your needs were met. Well, no. The state of having your needs met is the state an infant is in when it decides to go to sleep, right? There's nothing to do. You're not built for hedonic gratification so that there's nothing left to strive for. Dostoevsky figured this out in the mid-1800s when he was criticizing like a socialist utopianism, because he said that if you just gave people everything they want, the first thing they would do is they just break everything into pieces so that something interesting would happen. We're not built for comfort, and that's good because life isn't comfortable. So if we're built for comfort, we're in real trouble. We're built for adventure, and on adventure, that's dancing playfully on the edge. And you might say, well, why? It's, well, because that's where you make yourself more than you are, and you can contend with the challenges of life. Like, you don't want your child to sit around doing nothing on the couch because all their needs are met. It's like you're gonna say, it's like, what are you doing sitting on the couch there? It's like, get out there and what? And do something. Have some fun, make some friends, take some risks, like intelligently. And then when you see your child pushing himself or herself beyond their current limits, if you're a parent that loves them at all, you're thrilled about that. It's not because they're safe. It's the same with your partner, your husband or your wife. You want to see them on the edge, transforming into the person that you love, because when you love them, you see what they could be, right? That's the nature of love, is to see that. And so you're not trying to shelter and protect. I mean, sometimes that's necessary if people are sick or they're old or they're hurt in some way and they need to be cared for in some manner that puts them back on their feet. But our life is adventure. That's why when we go to see movies, we don't go watch people eat. You know, we don't watch people sleep because they're comfortable or be warm. We watch them go do dangerous, exciting, challenging things in a way that's romantic and adventurous, and that's life.
That's one of the things that worries me right now is we do seem to have a generation that has been raised by concierge parents who do want their kids to be safe on the couch, staring at a screen, instead of getting out and experiencing life, observing themselves overcome obstacles, observing themselves master their environment, attributing to themselves the ability to do certain things and forming a self-image and self-esteem and attributing to themselves the ability to do that. And so much of what's happening right now is so wrong because the job of parenting is to prepare children for the next level of life, and that's not happening in so many homes right now with parents that are overprotecting children. I saw it during COVID with parents going around with these bleach wipes, wiping everything down, and I said, you're compromising their immune system. When they get back out, we're gonna have the worst cold and flu season you've ever seen because they kept them in a bubble.
Exposed enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we need kids to get out and try things.
Well, so one of the things you do see in the course of the biblical stories is that there are times when the Israelites have a society of plenty, which is what we have now. And there are different moral challenges in a society of plenty than in a society of privation, right? Like a pioneer society where you're struggling just for the basics of life. There are moral temptations that come along with a life of plenty, and one of them is what? Obese slothfulness, let's say, a lazy, obese, terrified slothfulness. It's like every minor impediment becomes exaggerated neurotically. I mean, if you have to have a problem, you'd probably want to have the problem of abundance rather than the problem of privation. But the problem of abundance is a problem. If you're wealthy, it's hard to deprive your children optimally, right? Because your child can come to you and say, can I have this? And you could say yes, and you could just purchase it, and it would make no material difference to you, assuming you're at a certain level of wealth. Obviously, that's not good for your child, but you have to figure that out. You know, in a society where there's privation, the challenges are just right there. In a society that's abundant, the challenges have to be taken on voluntarily. And we haven't had a society of abundance for very long, and we don't exactly know how to do that. And so we fall prey to mistakes like overprotecting our children, even though there's less for them to worry about than there ever has been in any real practical way. You know, so these are real problems.
This is something that I felt strongly about because in America, for example, I think our educational system is collapsing. We're sliding down the international scale. We don't teach people about this kind of thing. And by the way, as an aside, we don't teach people how to think and feel and self-motivate in
Negotiate.
School. Exactly. We teach them reading, writing, arithmetic, but not very well. You are passionate enough about this that you started an entire academy, Peterson Academy, where you're bringing in the top minds around the world to teach about essential elements of being, how to be the best that you can be who you are. And it really ties in with a lot of the passion that you have behind this book.
We started Peterson Academy about 2 months ago, and I'd been planning it with my daughter and my family for a long time before that. And I'm in a fortunate position, partly because of my podcast and partly because of my academic connections. I've met many great professors and speakers all over the world. And so I've been able to invite them to lecture for us, and the vast majority of them have agreed to do that. And so we've found the best lectures in the world, and we've filmed them in a more professional manner than anyone else has ever, by a lot. Like, the production quality is extremely high. We've used artificial intelligence illustrations to fill in the back walls, to illustrate what they're discussing. And we've offered the people that we've invited an open field for their lectures. They can lecture on whatever they want. Like, my offer to them is, I picked you because I think you're great. I'm going to get out of your way. You can lecture in whatever way you want about exactly what you think is most important and that you find most compelling. And so that's a pretty good offer for the professors, because it's hard to do that in a university with the administrative constraints. And so we have about 30 courses online already. We're going to release 4 a month starting in January. We can offer an elite class education that's traditionally grounded. A lot of the people that are lecturing are people whose ideas I've relied on to flesh out the concepts that I'm developing in this book. So a number of them, John Vervaeke is a good example. He's a cognitive scientist from the University of Toronto. He's on the cutting edge of neuroscience conceptualization. Jonathan Pageau is a very, very deep religious thinker. He's lecturing for us. So the lecture series itself, comprehensively defined, is all the people lecturing are on the cutting edge of their disciplines. And so that's extremely exciting. And we think we can offer degree equivalent education for 95% reduction in cost with a 10 times improvement in quality. So that's a pretty good deal. We have 40,000 students already. We've only been going for about a month and a half. And so soon we'll have translation so that we can make this available to everybody. And my daughter, Michaela, and her team, man, they've done a bang-up job on the production quality.
Everything about your messaging is positive, challenging, optimistic.
Realistic.
Very realistic, which is the challenging part. I mean, people have to be real with themselves. And you talk about the fact that if you're not a hero in your own life, then you've missed the whole point of existence. Who wants to be a passenger? And I talk about the fact for years that, for example, there's going to be one Jordan B. Peterson in this world ever in the history of mankind. Somebody may share.
Well.
It may seem like there's more, but people may share the name, but there's only going to be one you. So what are you going to do with that? If you don't star in your own life, who wants to be a bit player in their own life? And you challenge people to do that.
Well, that's what Pinocchio is at the beginning of his adventure, right? Because he has these strings and invisible forces are pulling on him from behind the scenes. And you don't want to be that. You don't want to be the puppet of invisible forces operating behind the scenes. And that is what you are unless you're playing this role in your own life. Now, what we should point out, this is very important, is that being the adventurer of your own journey isn't the same as being like a self-centered narcissist. Those aren't the same thing, because the proper adventure is one of responsible sacrifice, right? That's a key message in this book. It's like, we live in a story. Okay, now that's established, I would say. It's established conceptually and philosophically and scientifically. It's the case. A story is the structure that we inhabit that organizes our perceptions and our actions. I think that's incontrovertible. Once that's established, another question emerges, which is, well, what's the story? Now, the postmodernist types insist that the story is one of power. Okay, that's not right. You can get somewhere with power, but it's a self-defeating strategy. Try tyrannizing your wife. That doesn't work well. Like, you can do it for short periods of time, but...
No, you can't.
There's going to be a kickback. Or if you're, let's say you're successful and you manage to dominate your wife or your husband, you do that successfully, but your punishment is that you're then married to a resentful doormat. And that's not a victory. And you become a tyrant. And tyrants tend to meet very vicious and brutal ends, one way or another, psychologically or physically. The proper story is one of responsible self-sacrifice. So the whole biblical library is an investigation into the structure of sacrifice. So what does that mean, and why should you be happy about that? Well, obviously you have to sacrifice if you want to be part of a community, because a community is the sacrifice of individuality to the community, right? If it's all about you, well, no one's going to want to be around you. Even as a kid, if you're 3 years old, you have to learn to take turns. That means you have to sacrifice your turn. Well, why? Well, how about so you have a friend? And so the sacrifice is justified by the community, right? And so once you know that, the next question is, well, what's the most effective form of sacrifice? And that is the question that the biblical stories wrestle with continually. What's the sacrifice that's most acceptable to God? Well, that's the responsible sacrifice of the present to the future, right? So that you invest in the future in the long run, so you're not impulsive and immature. And it's the responsible sacrifice of yourself to what's highest. And that would mean within your marriage, say, that would mean you sacrifice yourself to the marriage, to your children, to your broader family, to your community, to your state, to your nation. And that's identity, like the identity that's everywhere. What's my identity? It's like, it's not in your head. Your identity is your relationship with all these higher order structures. And you want to sacrifice yourself voluntarily to that so that you exist in harmony with your wife, with your kids, with your extended family, with your community. And that requires responsibility. There's immense meaning in that. You know that if you're trying to reconcile yourself to your conscience as it harasses you for your inadequacies, that part of the argument you're going to make to yourself about your own validity is your memories of the times that you acted properly on behalf of what? Other people. Maybe even people who weren't positively predisposed to you, where you went out of your way to be useful, and it worked, right? Everyone who's civilized, socialized, mature, everyone who has those characteristics finds the deepest meaning in their life in pursuit of voluntary, responsible sacrifice. And that's no different than adventure, which is also on something that's cool.
You've been a dishwasher, a short order cook, a beekeeper, a tow truck driver, a gas jockey, a bartender, a plywood mill laborer, and a railroad line worker.
Yeah.
What did you think about while you were doing those jobs?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
Well, on the rail line, so this was in southern Saskatchewan when I was about 18, I had this job. I was a peanut pounder, and what I did was when the rails were being laid, there are metal plates that go on the ties that the rails fit in.
Yeah.
There's a hole through the plates, and you put in these wooden pegs to hold the plate in place so the people who pound the spikes can pound the spikes in the plates. The guy in front of me who was on a machine would drop the little wooden peg into a hole, and then I'd pound it in. And I was doing that like 16 hours a day on the prairie. And so that didn't require a lot of thought. It was pretty automatic. And so I had like 16 hours a day to think. And so I was thinking about many of the things that we're talking about today. So I spent a lot of time on that rail crew. I had 16 hours a day to think, so.
Well, you used them all.
One of the things that I learned, I knew that you find the adventure of your life in part by looking for what calls to you, right? What attracts your interest, what compels you. And that's elaborated quite thoroughly in the biblical stories. But the other definition of God that emerges continually is God as conscience. And so you could say, well, where do you find your purpose in the land of abundance? And the answer is, well, you look at what calls to you and compels your interest and excites you and fills you with enthusiasm, which etymologically means to be filled with the Spirit of God, to be enthusiastic. Theos is Deos. And you look at what bothers your conscience, right? Remember in the Pinocchio story when Pinocchio is trying to shed his strings because he's being pulled every which way by forces behind the scenes. He has a conscience. That's JC, Jiminy Cricket, who reminds him of his moral duty. And you might say, well, why would you do your moral duty? And the answer to that is, well, it's good for you because it puts you on the edge, but it's also the place where you find the responsible adventure of your life, right? We're built for weight. That's why you're supposed to hoist your cross as you walk uphill. We're built for weight, and the best weight is the one that you shoulder voluntarily. And the best weight to shoulder voluntarily is the heaviest weight you can carry and still move uphill. And so that's a hard thing to figure out when you're in the land of abundance, and in some ways everything's at your fingertips, right? And we're wrestling with that. It's a complicated thing to get straight.
It's hard. You have to figure out what it means to love your child. And loving them means making them the best they can be versus the most comfortable they can be. Right. All right, well, we're out of time. The book is We Who Wrestle with God, Perceptions of the Divine, which is available everywhere books are sold. And by the way, everybody in the audience is going home with a copy. If you want more information on the Peterson Academy, you can go to petersonacademy.com. There's so much quality information about enriching your life and getting the most that you can out of it. I highly recommend and endorse it. I really do. So read the book, look at Peterson Academy. I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being my friend.
Hey, man, it's
Thanks
a pleasure.
so much.
Yeah.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Marketing is hard. But I'll tell you a little secret. It doesn't have to be. Let me point something out. You're listening to a podcast right now, and it's great. You love the host. You seek it out and download it. You listen to it while driving, working out, cooking, even going to the bathroom. Podcasts are a pretty close companion. And this is a podcast ad. Did I get your attention? You can reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Libsyn Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a pre-produced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience in their favorite podcasts with Libsyn Ads. Go to libsynads.com, that's LIBSYN, ads.com today.
In the dry states of the Southwest, there's a group that's been denied a basic human right.
In the Navajo Nation today, a third of our households don't have running water.
But that's not something they chose for themselves. Can the Navajo people reclaim their right to water and contend with the government's legacy of control and neglect?
Our water, our future. Our water, our future.
That's in the next season of Reclaimed, the lifeblood of Navajo Nation. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.